So just a little bit about my background in this process. I have done one migration from Oracle to SQL Server when I was in EUP, and so I've learned a few things along the way. I don't know everything. I'm not an expert on this. Like I said, Jason's going to be a great resource to tap into as we do this. But I wanted to just share a few of the things that I picked up along the way. And this will be a little bit more from a coder's perspective. So we'll look at some C# code that can help us do a few things.
This meeting is being recorded.
I just started the recording.
Okay, thanks, Jim.
You're welcome.
All right, let's just move on here.
What you say, everything will be recorded.
So the first thing we need from a C# perspective or from a .NET perspective is a way to talk to Oracle. SQL Server is you get that out of the box when you install Visual Studio. There's really nothing special you have to do to make sure that you can connect to SQL Server. But Oracle, you'll need some drivers, and there's two main ones that I'm aware of that we use. One is odp.net, which is the official Oracle supported version. The biggest problem with it is it usually lags behind a little bit. Like for instance, we've just shipped Visual Studio 2017, and I don't even think they have full support for 2015, Visual Studio 2015 yet in their integration, but they do for 2013. But it works pretty well. Has anybody here used odp.net on any of their? You are? How's that working out for you, Carlos?
Mine is pretty old because it was a project I started a while back, but yeah.
Yeah, it works fine. Yeah, it usually works okay. The other one is DevArt, which we do have a license for. I think Jim's gotten that. What version are we on DevArt? Do you know? Is it like 8 or 9, something like that? So DevArt, they're a third-party company, and they're really pretty quick to support new features and to support. I don't know if their current version actually supports 2017, so we probably are due for an update on that. But the difference is it's paid versus free, but it works pretty well. I remember early on when we were introducing Oracle RAC, odp.net wouldn't let us take advantage of that because it was a little bit older. We had to do some weird things, but DevArt would. DevArt had support for some link syntax that odp.net didn't early on, but they're pretty similar to each other right now. So those are the two of the options. The Oracle drivers you can get from the Oracle website directly. The DevArt drivers, if you go to integration point, ip.ldschurch.org, and do a search for DevArt, Jim has a little article on there and a link to the DevArt drivers that you can download that are licensed for us to use. And I don't know if my voice is going to hold out today, but okay.
I'll take over for you.
Jim will take over if I fall over and die. We want to talk a little bit about architecture before we get too far down the path. So if you've worked on projects like I have, and I know some of you have worked with me on those projects like FMAT, that thing is what we would call, some people refer to it as a monolith, that particular application, but that's actually kind of incorrect. What they really are talking about is something called a megalith. A monolith actually is incorrectly used in the industry, and when they talk about it, and what they're really referring to is something called a megalith. But a monolith in itself mono means singular, and so it's singular in purpose. And that can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. But typically what happens is when we build applications in enterprise, it starts as a monolith. It has a singular purpose and it's well defined, but it gets bolted on and bolted on and bolted on. By the time you're done, you end up with something called a megalith, and it is very unwieldy and difficult to change and to release and to test and so on and so forth. So there's this movement in the industry to move from monolithic to modular is what they call it. And what we're trying to do is divide our applications into smaller pieces and keep their purposes more singular in purpose and like in nature. So as we're migrating our applications from Oracle to SQL Server, this is a great time to take a little bit of opportunity to look at what we've written and say, hey, can we divide these into smaller pieces? Instead of migrating one gigantic application, can we break this into smaller chunks and modules and host them separately and build them separately and move them separately? And if we can, I think this would be a great time to take advantage of that and do so. We want to try and make our pieces independently deployable. We want to connect them together using service-based architecture like REST. And we want to adhere to separation of concerns. We want to keep our front end and our back end not commingled. Jonathan, don't give me that face. So, and really in the .NET space, what that means is we prefer to use Web API and use separate front end architecture like React or Angular 1 or those types of technologies where we're not relying on MVC and Razor syntax and commingling C# code inside of HTML. That's kind of a thing of the past anymore. I know that there's still support for it and you can still build applications that way, but we're trying to move away from that idea. We want to keep those layers separated from each other so that we don't run into a big hairy mess when it's time to move forward. The other thing that's pushing that is the mobile space. If you build mobile applications, you want to be able to reuse your backend and not have dependencies on things like MVC, where that can't be consumed by a mobile application. So just adhere to separation of concerns. Another thing to do is abstract the persistence layer using something like an ORM like Entity Framework. So you'll see in a lot of the applications that I've written, I use a repository layer. And honestly, sometimes I stop and I look at it and think, why am I writing this layer? It's just a pass-through. There's almost nothing in it half the time. One of the reasons, though, that I continue to keep that discipline and make that extra layer, if you will, is to give myself the flexibility to be able to make changes in that layer, to abstract away the persistence layer so that I'm not stuck with a particular architecture or a database structure. And honestly, that's a little bit academic. I mean, how many times do we actually switch out databases in our career? Not a lot. If you build it on Oracle, you usually keep it on Oracle and you ship it. But here we have an opportunity. Our organization's going through a shift, and now we get to take advantage of the architecture that we've been building for what felt like academic purposes, and now it's a reality. We get to do it, okay? And so we'll see how well it holds up. I've had to do it just twice, and I've been grateful that I used the repository layer for that purpose. And there are other reasons for that layer, and I have another presentation on that I'll point you to a little bit later that goes into more detail. The next thing to evaluate is the need for relational constructs. We've used relational databases for as long as I can remember, and they still get the job done, and they do a very, very good job of getting the job done. But there are instances where it may not make sense to use a relational database, and you want to evaluate your particular project and determine if it makes sense to use something like a NoSQL option, which means not only SQL, not NoSQL, but and we have an enterprise solution here at the church that is our standard NoSQL solution, MarkLogic. And I'll give you a little bit of caution on that. Here, we can use it with .NET, but it's a little more cumbersome. The support for .NET is not great in MarkLogic yet. I know that that's on their to-do list to make that a little bit better. But we do have a portfolio that is using it. If you've ever used the Just Serve project, or that mobile application, that entire application is a .NET application that is back-ended with MarkLogic. And the engineer that was in charge of that project was able to wrap the API calls in a simple little C# class library that makes it easy to kind of interface and talk to that. But as far as full-on support, it's a little soft there, but we hope that'll improve in the future. The next thing is remove business logic from the database and put it in the service layer. FMAT, Bill, do we have any business logic in the database?
We're not as bad as missionary, but we're number 2.
Right, there you go. So there's a lot of you can get a little crazy with your stored procedures, and there's still room to use a stored procedure when you need to, but don't use it as your business logic layer if you can help it. So,
Actually, I could let the other bill address missionary.
oh yeah,
There were 3 companies I came from where that was the only thing that would have allowed them to provide the services they did, having processing right next to the data. Here we don't usually have that problem because our database is volume and everything is much smaller.
right.
So that occasionally there's call for it, but yeah, when I first got here, it was the whole once you hammer everything's in the air, nailed.
Right.
They were generating table APIs for everything. Half of it wasn't being used. Yeah, there's a whole lot of cleanup we have yet to do.
And so we want to be careful when we move forward that we don't make the same errors. And all right, enough of that. Let's move on. So that's architecture. Any questions on architecture, monolithic to modular? Yeah.
Something we don't talk about much here is that there's business logic and there's data logic / rules, and there's certain things you want the database to be in charge of, just in case certain updates don't go through your service layer. They might be coming in through some ETL process or a DBA modifying it. You want the database to be in charge of certain rules, like whether it can be empty, how long it is, certain things, but
Right.
I don't think many developers are cognizant of that, and they tend to lump it all together, both data rules and business logic.
Right. I think that's good. That's good. Good feedback. All right. Let's talk about Entity Framework just briefly. How many people here actually use Entity Framework today or have used it? So we won't go too much on that. As you know, it's Microsoft's ORM. The biggest change that came, it started in 6. There's still support for EDMX, but in EF Core 1.0, it's gone. Is support for the older XML-based EDMX format. That's gone. So if you're using that, you want to get off of that as quickly as you can. And Jonathan was not sad to get off that. He does not like it anyway. So use Code First. And Code First is a terrible name that Microsoft came up with because even though it says Code First, rarely do I actually use Code First. I use database first, code first, because I'm kind of old-fashioned that way. I go build my tables first, and then I generate my models off of my table. That's just me. You don't have to. Code first does allow you to actually go and create your models in C# first, and then you can use migration to keep your database structure updated. But like I said, you want to work with your DBA on that and decide what actually makes the most sense for you. I personally don't use migrations that much. I prefer to do it the other way. EF 6.0 is built on the .NET framework proper, old, I guess. And then EF Core 1.0, which was EF 7, is it's a cross-platform compatible version of Entity Framework. And it's a new one going forward. And like I said, they've made some breaking changes in it, but a lot of it still works kind of the same. And just one caution when using link joins. I had to help a portfolio the other day that they had mapped all their tables to classes, and they were doing some really crazy stuff in link. And link is wonderful. We love link. If you've ever had to go to another language that doesn't have link, you want to poke your eyes out because you love link so much. And link is great, and it does a really good job most of the time, but sometimes it doesn't. And in this particular case, their model was a little crazy. They had a bunch of tables. They were doing outer joins. They were doing projections into view models. And within those projections, they were doing inline ternary checks. And that stuff just doesn't convert itself from an expression tree into SQL perfectly every time. And in their particular case, it was actually writing the SQL wrong and not pulling back some of the data. And so you just want to be cautious, just a little caution when you do that. Here is my advice in that particular instance. Create a view, map on top of the view. That will give you better performance, gives the database a chance to optimize that view, and you have a little bit more control over it. If you really need something really complicated like that, don't try to do it all in link. that's all I want to say about any framework. There's a link in here, but you can go up to the Integration Point website. And I think it was February of last year, we did a .NET Engineering Forum on Entity Framework. There's a lot more details in there, and I kind of go in and show you sometimes, some of the code that gets generated, the SQL that gets generated from Link when things get too hairy. So if you want to know more about Entity Framework, go watch that presentation. All right. Here's one. Who's used SQL bulk copy before? Anybody? Okay. Yeah, good. How's that work for you? Pretty good. Performance is really good. It's fast. So here's how I use SQL bulk copy. When we were transitioning in EUP from Oracle to SQL Server, there's a period of time where we were writing our code against the new SQL Server database, but we wanted the data that was continually updating in Oracle to be in sync with SQL Server. And there are other ways to do this, but this is the way that we implemented. In fact, I think, Jason, you guys may even have tools for that, for keeping databases in sync like this. But if you need to do this, you don't have to do it from Oracle to SQL Server. You can do it from SQL Server to SQL Server. SQL bulk copy is a pretty cool tool that lets you do that. It's all code-based. You have to write code. But in essence, you can take a table here and a table here. And the easiest is if the schema matches, like if the table names are the same, which means that in our case, when we made our SQL Server tables, we made them match exactly. So it has the uppercase with underscore look to it, which wasn't pretty. If I had to go back and do it again, I'd probably go and use Pascal case on the SQL Server side and use column mapping, which is an option inside of bulk copy where I could map those together. And then that's because down the road, as you express those objects and push them all the way up like into JavaScript. And camel cased Oracle table names look yucky. And front end people don't like to see that. So you either end up doing a whole bunch of like data layer nonsense by creating exact objects that look similar to it with better names or whatever. It's nasty stuff. So if I had to do it again, I would use Pascal casing in my SQL Server database and just map them using the mapper fields.
Tony?
Yeah.
I think it just depends on whether you want to fold in a new naming convention or if you're rewriting the application. Then you can move towards a different naming convention, but oftentimes you say, well, if we're just migrating and trying to make it simple, then just use the old naming. But if you have an opportunity to fold in some re-architecture, new naming convention, that's great.
Yeah. And that's kind of, and that's project by project. You guys will figure out what makes sense for your project. So I want to take a peek at this code real quickly for SQL bulk copy. I've posted a document on an integration point. If you just do a search for bulk copy, it'll come up. But I've given two examples. I have a transactional and a non-transactional example. So you can see transactional bulk copy sample, a non-transactional bulk copy sample. And these were kind of generic methods that I created where you pass in this case, an Oracle connection, a SQL connection, the source table name and the destination table name, and it really just goes and takes it from there. And you'll notice one of the things that it does is it selects star from the source table, creates a new Oracle command, and it executes a reader. On the destination, we just create a connection to SQL Server and open that connection. And down here, here's what I found that was interesting. When I was trying to keep the tables in sync, I tried to get really fancy and say, okay, well, we only have, 500 records a day that really get updated in the source. Let's get really smart, find those 500 records here, find the 500 records in the destination, and just see what's different and try to update that. Turns out that stinks, and it's slow, and it's not very performant. It was faster, even on some of these tables that had like 500,000 records in it, to truncate the whole table and do a SQL bulk copy. It took just a couple of seconds to do that versus trying to get really fancy. So what you see in here is I actually truncate the destination table, and you can tweak these batch sizes, by the way, and then It calls this bulk copy write to server with the source. In this case, do a transaction commit. If there's an exception, I roll back. So in those cases where I couldn't afford to lose the data on the destination side, I would use a transaction and roll back. But there's performance hit if you need that transaction capability, and it takes a fair amount of rollback space as well. So be aware of that.
In hierarchy where you have one or two child tables, do you have to handle that, or is this tool good?
I don't really know. I've never had to deal with that part, so you'd probably handle it, but I'm not sure. It does do things like, in this case, you'll see there's an option in here, and I haven't used all those options, but there's a lot of different options. This one says to keep the identity. So if in the source it has an ID field and you want to keep those numbers and preserve them, that's an option. You can choose not to if you want to, or you can choose to preserve them. And so that is an option there. So if you want to go look at that code and study it, it's not it's not too complicated. And I put, for Jim's sake, I put comments all throughout it. Yeah, you're welcome. I know. He's always telling me I'm not putting enough comments in, so I put lots of comments in there for you.
It's better to have useful comments.
You didn't say useful. You just said you wanted comments. Okay. That's enough of SQL bulk copy. Let's move on. Okay, SQL Server data tools in Visual Studio. So let's zoom in on this. When you're installing Visual Studio 2015 or 2017 now, there's a checkbox option on there for Microsoft SQL Server data tools. When you're in Visual Studio, I don't know how many people use the SQL Server data tools in Visual Studio. Few people? How many people use SQL Server Management Studio? Okay, yeah, I use both, and it kind of just depends on how I'm feeling that day. But to get those installed, you have to make sure you check that box, and then you'll get those installed.
On the SSDT, it's actually, they've got it available as a separate install. Install the Visual Studio shell if you want to just install the SSDT.
Yep.
So a lot of our BI engineers will just install that standalone SSDT so that they can create like SQL Server reporting services projects or integration services projects without having the application stuff, the C# projects.
Yep, that's good. Okay, yeah. Of course, most of us are developers. We're in Visual Studio anyway, but yeah, that's nice to know that you can just install that standalone if you want. All right, so let's see. Do we want to look at any of those? I can't remember. What's coming up next? Yeah, we'll look at it here as we look at the SQL project type. How many people have used SQL project type as the actual project type in Visual Studio? Anybody? All right, well, good. I was hoping nobody would use this because I wanted something that you wanted to learn something new, right? The SQL Server project type is actually, that's exactly what it is. There's a project type in Visual Studio. What it lets you do is check your schema into source control. So it's a pretty cool little option to have. And I have one in here. So let's open this guy here. So I'm going to close that. You'll see in the Integration Point website, by the way, Integration Point is a .NET front end, .NET application that points to a Java backend for all the document storage, and then I think this, and it's going to be rewritten here shortly so that the actual client side is written in React. So we're trying to use all these different technologies together, but currently it's Angular 1, but it's going to go through a process and get rewritten into React. Okay, so this particular project has this thing called a database project, and you can see, I don't know if you can see that icon, but it looks like a database. And it has the SQL for the tables and the views. So I think a lot of people, when they are building their projects, they write a bunch of scripts. You've got a database that's out there. You need to add a column to it. So then you write an alter script and you save that somewhere. And bundle all that up, and then come release day, you try to remember to run all those scripts, and that's kind of how it works. Well, this is actually kind of a cool way to do things, because you can, like I said, you can check in your code and you can see this. It's not anything fancy, but here's the actual SQL for the create table. But you also get this UI here, so you can make changes if you want. Here's where it gets really cool. If you right-click this database project, you can say, let's do a schema compare. So my source is going to be my database project, and I'm actually going to select a target, and I'm going to select an actual database that I have running locally on my machine. So I have SQL Server running on my machine, and I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to click the compare button and let that run. While that runs, I'm going to pull up the SQL Server Management Studio and just take a look. So here's the database that I have running locally on my machine, and you'll see I have no tables in there. I just have an empty database with no tables in it. The reason I'm showing you that is because this is going to be a magic trick. There's nothing up my sleeve. Maybe. All right, so the SQL compare ran, and if I go look at the object definitions, this is what it found. It said, hey, your source has these tables in it, and your target doesn't. So the action is that big green plus. If I choose to click that update button, it's going to go and push that schema into the database for me. So I'm going to go ahead and click update. You sure you want to do that? Yes. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. This one, the update failed for a reason, and I think I'm going to turn off the full text catalog. Run compare. Let's run compare again. And let's press update again. Let's try it again. Failed. So I really do have nothing up my sleeve. Sorry. Let's view the results. So I don't know why it's failing, but it will tell me usually, you've done something wrong. An error occurred while the batch was being executed. I can't see that. The font's too tiny.
Looks like it's trying to create that full text index even though you deselected.
I told it not to. I said, don't do that.
It's an index on the table, so you have to look at the docs table.
Gotta take that off too, huh? Let's try it again. Okay. Oh, so that's the only one that didn't go in the view. Let's try it again. Yay, it's happy now. Okay, so now if I go back to here and hit refresh, boom, I have tables. So it's a nice little tool to kind of help you do things, and it goes the other way. You can switch the directions, and you can point it at, let's say you want to point it at production or dev. You can make a snapshot of what it looks like, bring it back down into your database project, save that, and check that in. So if you do need to restore, I think it's a good way to kind of keep track of all your scripts and whatnot. And the tools, like I said, the tool's really good. It's smarter than I am. Yeah, question, Dan? So you're talking about like data compare. So there's schema compare and there is data compare. Great question. So if we go under Tools, SQL Server, I can create a new data comparison. Now in this particular case, it's going to be a little boring because I just pushed that schema over and both sides have no data in them. Your project database has no data in it, it's just schema. But you can do things, so let's go back and just look at that real quick. This project database, or database project here, you have tables, views, you can do things like it'll snapshot the stored procedures, any user-defined functions that you create. And then if you want seed data, you can actually write scripts that will inject seed data as well and keep that all in this project. But its purpose isn't, you can't do a data compare like from a database to your project and then put all that data in there. It's not a database. It can't hold all that directly, but that's a little different. So, but data compare is a tool that will let you compare between two databases and keep the data in sync as well. So if you need something different than like bulk copy and you just want to make sure that, like for instance, what I do is when I'm pushing out to production new data, and I want to make sure that like I have a list of values, and I've added 3 list of values in dev, and I want them to I want to make sure that they appear in production. I'll do a data compare on that table to make sure that the data is there and it's the same, and it preserves things like the identity and stuff when you do that, and it's visual and you can kind of see the difference. But I don't know if we'll have time to look at that in detail. Any other questions? There's support for pre-build, build, and post-build scripts as well. So if you need to run something special outside of that, like I said, inserting seed data, you can do that as well. It also has debugging support too. I've never used that, but I was reading about it. It looks kind of interesting. If you need to, like if you had a stored procedure that was a little bit complicated that was invoked by code and you wanted to connect the Visual Studio debugger to it and step through it, you can actually do that in this database project type, and it'll take that source and tie it together and give you some debugging. I've never used it, but I hear it's pretty cool. All right, schema data compare tools work on top of it. So let's talk about compare tools real quick. We just took a sneak peek at Schema Compare. It's built into Visual Studio 2015, 2017, and I can't remember if it's built into 2013. It might be in 2013 as well. Data Compare is also built in. There are third-party companies that build compare tools as well. The SQL Redgate tools are ones that I've used, and they have data compare tools for Oracle and for SQL Server and Postgres and a whole bunch of other things. They're a little more expensive, but their tools are really, really excellent. The stuff you get in Visual Studio is pretty good, and it will probably take care of most of your needs. But if you need something like, if you want that Ferrari of compare tools, I love the SQL Redgate tools. Morgan.
Isn't Redgate in 2017 Enterprise by default?
So yes, they're advertising in 2017.
Oh, okay.
Visual Studio 2017 includes a few tools from Redgate. Compare is not one of those, but they do have a few tools that they've included in there to kind of get their name out there so that people will be aware of them. There's some others out there like OpenDB-Diff, DB-Compare, Pragmatic Works. DevArt has DB-Forge, and there's more. So if you want to shop around and pick a tool, that's fine. Like I said, most things work fine with the built-in. What I've found with the Redgate tools is they're a lot faster. Like if you're patient, Visual Studio is fine for your schema and your data compares, but they take a little longer. The Redgate tools are just blazing fast, and I don't know what secret sauce they have to make it work, but it's cool. Okay, SQL Server Management Studio. This is an integrated environment for accessing, configuring, managing, administering, all that good stuff. And most of us use this, so we won't dig into this too much. But you can just download that tool. That's this tool right here. Where are you?
One mention, if you're working with the SQL Server 2016 instance, then you need Management Studio version 2016, or it won't connect.
Correct. Good point. So to repeat that, if you're using SQL Server 2016, you'll want to make sure you have the SQL Server Management Studio 2016 to connect to it. So
Another ad for 2016, they've added an if exists clause to many drop statements, which makes your scripting easier.
okay, yeah, great. Good to know. Thanks. I won't dig into this too much.
So is 2016 back compatible?
Yes,
Yes.
it is backwards compatible. Yeah, that's the one I use too, because I have a lot of databases in Azure, and so I like to make sure I'm on the latest with that, because Azure has some quirks to it that are a little bit different than standalone. All right, that's all I'm going to say about that. Let's move on. Here's one tip for you. If anybody's used the SQL Server Management Studio to modify a table through the designer, and they've got the changes just the way they want, and they hit save, and they get this dialog prompt that comes up and says, you can't save these changes, there's data, and you might lose data, and blah, 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 and it won't let you, it blocks you. This, I see a lot of people run into this. Here's where you have to go. If you go into Tools, Options, Designers, there's a little checkbox there, and I've highlighted it with my pen. It says, prevent saving changes that require table recreation. If that box is checked, it'll drive you just absolutely batty, and you can't figure out what's going on. Just go and check that box, and you can make the change. And of course, I'm referring primarily to a dev environment here, when you're working in dev. Okay. Remember that one. When you're annoyed, just remember that checkbox is there. Okay, who uses Visual Studio Code? Anybody in here use VS Code? Anybody on a Macintosh? Mac computer? You are. So there isn't, I don't think the SQL Server Management Studio runs on a Mac yet. I imagine they'll do that at some point. Now that by the way, SQL Server, there's a Linux edition that is being developed, and I don't know if they've shipped that or if it's still in preview. Do you know? It's still in preview, right? So I think at some point there may be SQL Server Management Studio and tools that will ship that will run on other platforms. But for today, we don't have those. But there are some tools that you can use. They're rudimentary, but they're nice. So this is Visual Studio Code. Let's increase the size here a little bit. And there is an add-in to VS Code. Boy, that's too big. There's an extension. If you click on this button here, you can look for extensions. I've added one called MS SQL, and you can see it's a 0.3.0, so it's still kind of a new thing. But it will allow you to take a SQL data type and run SQL. So if you look down at the bottom where my cursor is pointing here, this allows you to change your language for the editor. So if you select SQL, then it will properly highlight your select statement as I've written here. So if I want to execute this, if I right click and I say execute query, it will run. Oh, by the way, the first time you do that, it's going to say, I can't execute that. We're not connected to anything. It'll walk you through some little prompts where you put in your connections information and your string and all that kind of stuff. I've already done that, so I'm connected to the SQL Server database that's running locally, and it's nothing too exciting, but it brings back data. Yay. There are some cool features with this. If you're working with in JavaScript and you want to mock some data for your front-end guy that looks like this data, rather than writing JSON by hand, which is not fun, this has a really cool option. If you right-click, is it right-click or is it this button right here? I think it's this button. So you can save the file as JSON. So I'm just going to save it to c:\users/Tony/desktop. I hope that's right. And call it test.json. Okay, so it saved it. And you'll see it generated some really cool, nice JSON for you. And you can give that to a front-end guy and have him work with it if you want. Of course, it's the casing is the same as what your database is, so he may not like that. He may have to go and do some adjustments. Okay, so that's in Visual Studio Code, and that runs on the Mac equally as well on the PC. So if you happen to be on a Mac or Linux and you need some just simple tools to be able to connect to a database and pull some data and do some querying, that's one of your options that you have. All right, that's all I'm going to say about that. Any questions? Okay, let's talk about SQL Profiler. Anybody use SQL Profiler in here before? Dan, I expect, yeah, you would. So when we talked earlier about how sometimes if you're running code and in an entity framework is generating some bad SQL and you can't really see what it's doing and you want to know what's happening, all you know is you're getting the data back in a weird way or you're not getting the data that you expect. If you want to take a peek at what's being sent or it's really slow, if you want to see what's being sent to SQL Server, then you may want to use SQL Profiler. So here's how you get to it. And I wish there was a way to increase the font size on this, but there's not. Inside of SQL Server Management Studio, there's tools, and one of them is the SQL Server Profiler. So if we fire this up, I'm going to connect to my local database, and I'm just going to say run, and clear this out. So here's Profiler. It's sitting there watching any calls that are coming into my database. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Let's see, where are you, code? Right here. And let's just execute that SQL again. You'll see in the back, Profiler caught that and captured that. So this one's not very exciting, but you can see here's the select statement that came through. Select star from dbo.performance. It tells you how many reads, how many writes, the duration of the execution, and so on and so forth. So it can show you a little bit of information there. So it's a nice handy way to capture that statement that's coming in, especially from Entity Framework, which, by the way, Entity Framework takes care of parameterizing your query for you, and you can see the parameters and see the values that are coming in and grab it and take a look at it. And that's how we track down the problem we were having with that portfolio that was having issues with their Entity Framework calls. We use SQL Profiler for that. There's a lot of other tools in here that you can use to kind of help you, but you can pull that SQL out, drop it back into SQL Server Management Studio, run an explain plan on it, all kinds of stuff like that, and tweak your performance. There's another tool in here which I haven't used. Has anybody used the Database Tuning Advisor? I haven't used that in here. I think it's the same engine that runs on Azure. Most of my databases that run in Azure have that turned on by default. And in the dashboard, and I get emails, frankly, it'll tell me recommendations. It says, hey, your queries are running a little slow on this particular table. We recommend you make an index on this column. So you look at that and you say, yeah, okay, or nah, you guys are crazy. But it's nice that it can give you those kinds of suggestions to tweak your performance for the database. So those tools are there.
What's that called?
The Database Tuning Advisor. So, like I said, I haven't used the standalone tool, but if you go to Management Studio, you can run the Database Engine Tuning Advisor. I've also read some articles where SQL Server Profiler that you can use that to kind of give you hints about tuning your database as well, but I haven't done that. So, like I said, I'm not an expert. I just play one on TV, right? Okay, let's go on to some other things. Just have a few left here that I want to try and cover. There's some special features in SQL Server, some of them that they probably exist in Oracle but under different names, so, and a lot of them you may have never used. So let's just look at a couple of these. First of all, one of the things you'll notice when coming from Oracle to SQL Server is that SQL Server has something called identity columns. Oracle's approach is a little bit different. What do they have? They have sequences, and you can... Oh, they do? Oh, finally. Cool. In your designer, so I'm looking at this table here, and hopefully you can see that. It might be a little small. But there's an option here that says identity specification. Really, it's just yes, no, turn it on. You can set what the increment is and what the seed is for your table. And instantly you have an integer-based identity column. So
Just a note on that, if you truncate the table, it resets the identity. If you just delete all the rows, it's going to keep the identity where it was.
that's a great tip, so I'll repeat that. If you truncate the table, it resets the identity back to your first seed. If you just delete data out of the table, even if you delete all of it, it will still pick up from that point going forward. So if you're at 100, the next one will be 101. So those are differences to be aware of. Thanks for that one. Thanks for reminding. That's great. All right, let's look at another little feature here. full-text search indexing. Let's come back to that in just a second. Let's look at computed columns while we're here. So I use computed columns every so often, and they're kind of fancy and nice to have, but you have to be a little careful with them. So on this computed column, you can create a specification and a formula. So here's a great example of a place that I might use this. Let's say that I have a table that has a first name and a last name, and how often do we go in our code and we create a full name or a preferred name object in our code, right? We do that all the time. Well, you can do that in the database as well. You can just write a formula here that says first name, which I don't have in here, but and save that and then call that like full name. And so that's a computed column that's computed off of data from the other columns. So, okay, that's not a big deal there. However, one of the benefits is you have an option you can see there where it says, is it persisted or not? And if you persist it, that will give you some options to create indexes on it. So in this case, I wouldn't want to create an index on full name necessarily, but there might be some things you'd want to do with that. An example is I have another project where I have booths. I don't know how to say that, but it's a trade show, and they have booths inside of this trade show. And each year we send them a custom code to help them if they want to keep their booth from the previous year. We email them this code. Well, that code is a computed column that we generate some formula each year, and it generates it for all of that data. And then we index that so that when they come in, they just put that code in, and it finds their booth for them and hooks it all up. Little things like that can really help performance so that there's not delays, and it's a nice little option to have. So be aware that computed columns is a cool feature that you may want to look into. So, but you don't have to. Yeah, Dan.
You or Chris or anyone know when computed columns showed up? Version?
It's been around a while. I want to say that it's been
At least 2005 or 2008.
yeah, it's been around a long time. There are other ways to accomplish this. So in Oracle, I wanted to accomplish something similar. You could create a column and then use like triggers on after update or whatever to populate it. It's kind of the same thing, and I'm pretty sure underneath that's really what's happening.
That
But
was version 9 and 10. Version 11, you have virtual columns at 6.
oh, so they have that too now. Okay, cool. Temporal tables. This one's new. I just learned about it, in fact, this month in the MSDN magazine. So temporal tables, and I've never used them, but I'm probably going to go turn that on in a place in integration point to kind of save our bacon in case somebody does something stupid and deletes all the data. So temporal tables are history tables. So you can take a table. In our case, it'll be our navigation table that we want to go and turn that on. And it essentially can snapshot the changes in data. It's kind of like an audit table, if you will, but it's a little bit different than an audit table. And you can go back to any point in time and say, what did the data look like right then? So if you imagine Cubs is the church unit banking system. They use audit tables in Oracle to do the same kind of thing. So they can go back at any point in time and say, what did that bank account look like at that point in time, and snapshot it. So in SQL Server, they have something called Temporal Tables, and I have a link in there if you're interested. When I post this on Integration Point, you can kind of go look at that. We won't look at it too much, but just be aware that that's a cool feature that's there. Memory optimized tables, that's another one that's kind of interesting. A lot of times you can speed some things up by pulling them into memory instead of keeping them on disk all the time. And a great example of that would be data that doesn't change very much, slowly changing data, slowly changing dimensions. So if you have a list of values and it hardly ever changes, but it's getting hit all of the time, you may want to pull that into memory as a memory optimized table. So when your code hits it, it's going to be really, really fast. Obviously, on the code side of things, if you go back and look at my entity framework presentation, I think I had intended to talk about, anyway, how to use caching in your application. You can cache it there as well, but if you don't need that level, you can just use memory optimized tables in SQL Server. They have role-level security, and now they have something called, and I just kind of glossed over that. You can go figure out what that means. And then JSON support. Just want to talk about that one real quick. Earlier we talked about when you're evaluating your project, do you really need relational? And there may be some cases where you don't. And there's some advantages to NoSQL databases in that they can be what we call schemaless, if you will. And there are times where you have data that may need to expand or contract, and you don't want to have to create a column for all that kind of stuff. So JSON data is a great way to do that. And NoSQL options give you that option. Well, SQL Server gives you some NoSQL capabilities built into it. So you can check in JSON data directly. And the JSON support, we won't dig into it here, but it's really kind of cool. You can actually query on top of that JSON data and join it with your relational data as well. So there's some pretty funky stuff that they can do. Do you have anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, just also, you can query a relational database table and have it output JSON to you.
Yep.
So, yeah, I agree, it's cool functionality.
So those are some things to consider. Yep. Bill.
I've got a whole presentation I give on this at Oracle conferences. I encourage those DBAs who are listening to talk to their developers, because too often the developers are making the decision without business stakeholders, whether or not they're doing relational or not. Developers should be aware of the consequences when they choose a document store, NoSQL solutions and so forth, to downstream users of their data, importing solutions, data warehousing, import, export. There's all sorts of consequences when they choose NoSQL. Anyway, they shouldn't make that decision in a vacuum.
Yeah, I agree. And what just to repeat the comment there is really when you're looking at using like NoSQL options or NoSQL features, that decision really shouldn't be made in a vacuum because it does affect a lot of downstream consumers. And so consider that as you look at those options.
There's just kind of maybe a couple trains of thought is either you consider your DBA as someone that helps you or someone that hurts you and makes things slow.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So if you have a relationship where you know your DBA has your best interest at heart, then you can work together in coming up with the best solution.
Yep. I think that's awesome. And having worked in portfolios that had DBAs and portfolios who don't have DBAs, sure is nice to have a DBA, isn't it? You know, so rely on them and work closely with them if you have one, and be thankful that you do. Okay, I was going to skip ahead to the FullText Search indexing. So this is a cool feature too. When I was originally working on the integration website, I had modeled the whole thing out front to back. Now today it's working a little differently. We've got a Java backend that actually stores all the documentation and all that. But before I had that, I had put all the documents into SQL Server and stored them in there, and I built FullText Search indexing on it. It's the first time I'd used that feature, and I was pretty impressed. It's really, really good. It allows you to query and create these indexes. So you can see here I created a full-text catalog called docs FTS. That's that thing on the left. And on the right, I created a full-text index on that document table. And I specifically pulled out title, author, abstract, body, and tags as part of the index. And so what it does is it kind of prioritizes those fields over the body of the document instead. So when you do a search and it gets hits, that comes back with a ranking, and it'll tell you, you know, this is more closely related to your search than this item is. And I was shocked that it was basically that easy to just set it up and then to use it. I don't know if you can read that. It's kind of tiny, but here was the code that I wrote. I had this method called FullText Search, and you pass the phrase in, and then I had a Boolean there to do a deep search or not. And if I did a deep search, I would do that first query. If I was just doing a deep search, would search the body of the document. Otherwise, I would just say, okay, just search titles, tags, you know, those types of author and that kind of thing in the abstract. And so I'd use that second query, and you can see I've highlighted it with my little online marker there. There's the difference. You say select blah, 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 blah from free text table docs, comma, star, comma, pass in the phrase, or free text table docs, comma, and then that second attribute there is, and I want you to look at title, abstract, and tags, and pass that phrase in. And then it'll return it by rank, and it gives a scoring to it. And it's pretty slick. It worked really, really, really well.
Is this limited to a single table?
I don't think it is. I think you can go across tables, but this was my first time using it, and I just did it on the one table. So, all right, getting towards the end here. And we haven't gone too deep on any of these things, but I just want to just make sure that we touch on a lot of these things so you're aware that they're available and they're tools in your tool belt. So SQL Azure is really awesome. It starts at $4.99 per month. And obviously, before we can use it in your particular project, you have to evaluate your project. Does your data belong out in a public cloud or not? And if it doesn't, then don't do it. But if it makes sense to go there, then you might want to consider that. There's some real benefits to using something like a SQL Azure. It's basically the same SQL that we would use, but there's some cool benefits that come with it. Number one, it's pretty cheap if you don't need a lot of performance. If you need a lot of performance, then it's expensive. It can get really expensive really quickly. You can get up to $1,000 a month for a really highly tuned, powerful database. So depending on what you need, it's there. But they have automatic failover, redundancy, backups, it's load balance. And the backups are awesome. I'll tell you I'll give you a sad experience that I had. We had an application that we were writing, and it collected registrations for a conference that people would come to. Well, one of the guys that I was working with, the day that people were showing up, they'd already registered and they're showing up to check in. He accidentally ran a query without a where clause. I know none of us have ever done that. He ran an update statement without a where clause and wiped out all the data telling us who had paid and who had not paid. And so there was thousands of people coming, and we had no idea who had paid and who had not paid. You want to talk about a guy who went completely white as a ghost after he realized what he had done. Luckily, we were in Azure, and they back up your data. They make snapshots every minute. We were able to go back in time to 1 minute before he made that terrible error, rolled back, and got all that data back. And it was awesome. And it was really pretty fast, too. It only took a few minutes to kind of roll back. And what it did is it doesn't roll back over the top of the production database. It loads a secondary instance of the database with its snapshot at that point in time. Then I ran my SQL compare tools because it's still a live database. There's new data coming in. And I was able to determine the data that had changed, that he had messed up, fix those things, but not touch the new data that had come in. Ran those SQL data compare tools, fixed it. We were back up and running, and no one was the wiser. People were. There was a delay. We had to say, system is down right now, and we'll be back up shortly. And so that saved us. And the other cool thing it has is like those automatic tuning advisor alerts, which are really nice.
Doesn't regular SQL Server have the ability to run full time as well?
I think it does, but you probably have to turn that on, I'm guessing. And
It's handled by regular database and log backups. It can restore to a point in time.
yeah, so I guess I've never had to use that on a regular SQL Server database, but
Oracle's flashback feature saves our bacon a lot. I was just hoping to hear the SQL Server had it as well.
I think it does.
And that's something that our Dan Sims is part of our SQL Server core team, and they manage, if we use an on-prem SQL Server, you get monitoring, you get backup recovery, you get failover, all these things are built in, right, Dan?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah. The part that surprised me, because we were running on the cheapest SQL Azure instance, was that you got all of that for $4.99 a month. I was like, wow. It wasn't an additional feature I had to pay for, so I like that was really handy. Okay. NoSQL options. Yeah.
Kind of sometimes as a developer, you just want your database and you want it now, right? So that's sometimes SQL Azure looks good or Amazon AWS looks good, and that might satisfy your requirement, but you'd be surprised how fast our SQL Server DBAs can kick out a database for you. If you're in a portfolio and you have a SQL Server instance, walk over to your DBA and he'll create a database for you. So it's just not, it doesn't take a whole lot of time for you to play on-prem. So just take that into consideration.
Yeah, and Dan's awesome. Every time we ask him for a database, it's there like like that. So yeah, appreciate you get the support there.
Well, and just to make the distinguishment, if your portfolio doesn't have a SQL Server instance, then that takes a couple days, you know, to spin up a VM, to install SQL Server, to get it patched, you know, service packed, all that. But if your portfolio already has a SQL Server instance, and you just need a database within that instance, that's the quick add.
Yep. Awesome. Okay, we're about done here. NoSQL options, we already talked about it a little bit. There's MarkLogic, which is our enterprise solution. And it's a powerful NoSQL solution. Right now it has kind of poor support for .NET, but we hope that will improve. But it has a well-documented REST API. And there are, like I said, there are groups that have used it. If that's something you need to look into, come talk to me and we can kind of connect you with those groups and show you what they've done. Others that I've used, like Azure Document DB and Azure Table Storage, they are pretty good at certain things, not good at other things, and it really just kind of depends on what your needs are if you're looking at those options. Mongo, CouchDB, Cassandra, others, we don't have any enterprise supported solutions there. And then I said, oh, and SQL Server. Don't forget SQL Server has some of those features and capabilities built in as well. So you can use those.
So is use of Azure supported by whatever team governs what technologies we use?
Yeah, so SQL, Azure itself, there are certain portfolios that are using that. We do have what we call an enterprise agreement. So it is a solution that we can use, as well as AWS. So AWS and Azure are the enterprise solutions that we have access to and to use. But you don't get to just go use it at your own will. You have to go and make sure that your portfolio is approved to use it and work with the cloud services team to get a subscription within that enterprise agreement. Then you can go ahead and move forward with it. Yeah.
From what I know, there's a cloud committee that's meeting and just getting together and defining, you know, how we use the cloud at the church and defining a few things. Michael, are you on that committee at all, or?
No, they meet every other week, though. They're very regular about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that will kind of shake out as we go forward, more processes and when you can and when you can't use cloud type stuff. I mean, we have to be kind of cautious about that. Some things in our organization don't belong out there. We want to definitely safeguard our data, keep it where it needs to be. But some data, you know, can be out there. It isn't that big of a deal. So it just really kind of depends. What I hope, though, is that all of you who have MSDN subscriptions, you get credit to use Azure. I think some of you, it's as much as $150 worth of credit in Azure each month. For your own personal use, go use it. Go play with it. Become familiar with it. And even if you don't use it in your portfolio or in your job, one thing that I've learned by playing out in Azure and is that there's some different considerations when you're writing your applications, when you're writing for cloud, that don't exist when you're writing for, you know, just Windows 2014 server or whatever. And you learn some techniques when you're writing your code about resiliency and redundancy and an expectation that the service that you may be talking to might not be there, right? And how to recover from those types of things. And the more you kind of play in that, the better you'll get at understanding those types of things. Then those types of features you can bring internally into your applications and make your applications better. And so that's my hope for you, is that you'll spend some time and play in there to make yourself a better developer for the church internally. So, okay. SQL Server is a powerful persistence engine, and hopefully you'll enjoy your time using it. And if you have any questions, talk to Jason. He's the expert. So, okay, thanks everybody. Appreciate it. Any questions? Jonathan, do you have any questions? Okay. All right, we'll turn the time over to our leader here, who will give away some amazing, amazing prizes.
Okay.